Well, good morning. I thought I'd take you with me today. So I'm off to visit my mum in the home, and we are creaking steadily towards the end of her having a physical body. And I'm aware I haven't spoken much about the feelings, and I felt that this would be an opportunity to do so. And it is just such a extraordinary ride when someone's passing, and if it's a tricky, uncomfortable, upsetting one like my mum's, and it's like just makes it so much harder. Of course it does. It's bound to, really. So I do go through lots of distress and pain. I'm very grateful for the plants that help me through the worst of it. And the great thing about them is they don't actually numb me or diminish it in any way whatsoever. That's the beauty. If I was to be consuming alcohol, then I would just have those feelings numbed, but that's not what happens. What happens with the plants is it changes my relationship with those feelings, whereby rather than it being unbearable, it's something that I am actually able to experience, in fact, in a way even more fully than if I wasn't benefiting from their presence. So always with me, respect the plants and love, of course. So because I'm in this part of the world, this is kind of the way journeys are out here. There's these incredibly slow little roads that are required to navigate. In order to get anywhere. That was just me reaching my bottle of water. So the other thing I want to say is it's really helpful to be aware that this kind of time causes people to become very triggered and very disturbed. And what it is if there's any unresolved stuff in that person's life, if there's anything major that's happened to them that hasn't been resolved, then someone's passing is enough to bring it all to the surface. And this is very much what has been happening with what I would call in my family the next generation. So you've got my mother's generation, and there's me, my generation, and there's a generation, the descendants from there. And I have become increasingly aware that this process has been very, very triggering and disturbing for them. And, well, it would be, wouldn't it, you think about it? Particularly because the ones I'm thinking of having in common is that their mothers have passed previously, and so whatever didn't get resolved then is coming up to be resolved now. So that's quite something. And to me, these roads in the southwest are quite something. When I used to live up in Lancashire, to go from one place to another is relatively straightforward, but here you've got these little tiny roads with a really slow speed. So it's a 2-hour journey for me, this, each way. And I'm getting used to it. One of the things I'm having to accept is that when I've done this journey, rather than having one day off to recover, I actually need 2. So I learned that. And of course there is the thing that I'm going through, which is a really tricky one, which is I want to be there for her, and I want to be there for her at the end, and of course there's no way to know whether that's going to happen. At the end there may be someone there, there may not, and having to accept that however it works out, that is how it is. Not get stressed or upset about it. So something else I wanted to mention is that it's a very pivotal time, this, because as she approaches the end of her life, all of the administrative bollocks, I'd like to call it, that's been in place to handle that, which is the power of attorney, it continues to function, and yet it's becoming increasingly aware that as we get closer and closer to when she does pass, the moment that happens, the power of attorney goes out the window, and we go into the purlieu of the will and all that's included there. And there is, thank goodness, some continuity, because myself and my sister are present in both the power of attorney and the will, and the next generation, as I call them, are present in the power of attorney and not in the will. So working out the appropriate transition from one stage of existence to the next has proved to be quite tricky, and I sought advice because it always seems the best thing to do, and very fortunately for me I listened to all the advice I got, because there was a very clear picture I got from one side, and then from another side I got a different picture, and I had to spend a bit of time working it out. And I realised I almost made the most dreadful mistake, because this is how it works, and these are the sort of things you need to know, because let's face it, it's like it happened to you at some point. If you've got anyone sufficiently close enough to you that they're going to depend on you when they pass, which is what this is all about, really. So when it comes to it, the moment the person dies, all their assets become frozen as soon as the authorities are informed, just like that. Now, if you're in a position where you're financially well enough off, and the one who's passing isn't, then it's just, there's no issue with any of this. But if it's a situation where it's the other way around, so in my case being a shamanic practitioner who's currently retired, it doesn't put me in a position to be able to handle what's coming up. And fortunately for me, I've been through this before, particularly with my dad, and also with my ex-wife, and also with my sister, and I have learnt some things as a result of all this. What a good thing too. So this is what I learned that when the person dies, their assets get frozen. So if you are in a position of being a trustee or an executor of a will, and all the stuff's got to be paid for, like the funeral and a whole load of other expenses, because that's the way things are done in this society, then if you haven't got enough money to cover these things, and you don't take action before your loved one dies, you would literally be up shit creek without a paddle in a barbed wire boat, which is not a position anyone wants to be in life. So, very grateful for the sound, practical common sense of both my partner and my sister for steering me in the right direction on this one. And so what I did is I spent the last couple of days, it's a funny old thing, isn't it, you know, wanting to focus on my mother's process, but having to already, because of remarks made by people, have to focus on this other stuff that comes ahead. And thank goodness I did, because if I hadn't done anything, that would have been my situation. So what I've done is I've done a transfer of a certain amount of money to cover all foreseeable expenses from her account, for which I have full power of attorney, into my own account, so that when the moment happens and she does pass and death certificate gets written out and all these things click into motion, I will not be in the absurd position of thinking, shit, how do I pay that bill? How do I pay this bill? How do I pay the other bill? It's like, no, I took action beforehand, so that at least one thing my mum is very concerned about, she's very concerned that I don't have a huge amount of difficulty and suffering that's unnecessary, that could be avoided through the application of a bit of common sense. And so this is a really important thing to consider here, isn't it? I do love this term common sense, because I was getting some views based upon administrative and, I can only really say, fear-based belief systems, that if I was to do this, take some money out, that could cause all sorts of problems for the will. It's exactly the opposite, in fact. Once I did my research, I realised it would have created all sorts of problems for myself and the administration of the will if I had not taken these steps. So that's it. So I've learned a huge amount from all this, to realise, first of all, it's great to listen to other people. Secondly, it's really important, and it's one of my weaknesses, my little kryptonite, so I can get so carried away by other people's opinions about what I should or shouldn't do. I can actually just very temporarily forget to check into, well, what do you reckon, Keith? And also, what does common sense have to say? So what common sense was saying is that my mother would want me to be in a position to be able to execute her will along with my sister. And in order to do that, we better have the money made available first. So as none of us have much money to speak of at all, then we had better put some of her money aside to take care of all the expenses which are inevitably going to accrue. And it does depend so much on the situation, because I've been through a few deaths, as you know. So with my wife, it really was simple. She didn't own anything. She didn't own any property, and she didn't have any significant savings. So for her, it was relatively straightforward. There was nothing for people to argue over, quite bluntly. With my mum, there's a flat which is worth a considerable sum of money just because property is so grossly overvalued in the UK, overvalued beyond belief, that it means that a tiny little flat is actually worth a lot of money. So what then happens is you have to deal with something which is called probate. And I actually did start doing this with my dad, and I was full-time employed for some months after my dad died, because my mother obviously found it all very difficult to cope with. So I stepped up and did as much of it as I could do, but I actually got to a point where I got ground into the dirt with the probate. I handled everything else fine. I handled the acquisition of the coffin, the funeral arrangements, being the funeral director, organising the burial plot, everything, all done absolutely fine. But when it came to the probate, that was the bit that actually started to unhinge me towards the end. So I remembered all that. I thought, well, I must make sure we've got enough money to pay for that this time. I don't want to put myself through that particular series of agonising, anguishing moments. Because when you're dealing with someone else's money, you want to be on the ball, and how can you be on the ball when this person you've loved has brought you up all your life and suddenly died? It doesn't make sense. So that's the bit that matters, I reckon. It's totally fine for me to be the funeral director, to manage all the logistical issues from the death, and to speak to all those things, but not to handle other people's money, no. So already set that one in motion, waiting for a quote today on the probate. So when someone dies in the UK, then you've got the will gets read, and gets taken on the basis of the will. That's a governing document, and the money in the bank account is frozen, property can't be sold. And then when the probate goes through, the probate basically is an instrument or a mechanism to say, right, this is all above board and we can prove it. So that process takes, in England, a long time. Takes months, can take a year, can take longer. And of course, during that time, no one's going to get any money. And that's something everyone has to face up to. And great gratitude to my sister and my partner. Thanks to you, common sense prevails. And I will be in a position with my sister to execute the will, and we will be able to afford to pay for things as and when they arise. So that's been my film today. So I've left Sidmouth, driven through Ford Sidbury, and I'm now just entering Honiton, and I'll shortly be getting on well, it's a bit of a joke, we call it the fast road, but it isn't actually, because you get about 1.5 miles of dual carriageway and back to a tiny single carriageway, really not any wider than this, for a fair old chunk as we go through the Blackdown Hills. So yeah, thanks very much for being with me on this. To be honest, I do want to really own up and say this, I find it so much easier to have a conversation with you via this medium than I do with people face to face, because I don't have anyone's issues or triggers to deal with. and that makes it so much easier. So I appreciate your time and your attention, and my intention about making these films is, this is the time I've noticed on Facebook, when people go through these periods of time, no one ever reveals what it's like. And of course, everyone needs to know what it's like, because it's something pretty much everyone has to face at some point. Even if you might not have living parents, there could be someone else who dies, like it was with my friend's mum when she died. I was living in the house, I had to step up then. So it's like, you never know. So that's why I'm doing this. And the idea is, if you watch these, just take it all in, pick out the bits that's relevant to you, and it'll just give you some idea about the things that you need to consider when this moment arises in your life. Because it's like, on the one hand, you've got all your emotions to deal with, you've got all the practical stuff to deal with, you've got the administrative bollocks to deal with, and on top of all that, you've got other people's issues and triggers and trauma to deal with. And I just want to end on this, to me, slightly funny note, because to me the big joke about a funeral is the person's mother or father has died and there's room for the people, and actually what happens is people come up and they unburden, they dump all their shit on the surviving person, and the person's going through all their stuff, but actually they found themselves being in the position of the unpaid counsellor for all those that are actually struggling with the death of this person, and what they've been through is so much worse because it's so much closer to them, but they're the ones having to be the counsellor, the helper, the advisor, the guide. So that's also part of the process, to realise that you might just discover that when you need the help most of all, that might be when it isn't forthcoming, and in fact you could actually have the opposite going on, whereby you get a bunch of hindrances to deal with and difficulties and obstacles thrown in your way, to such an extent you might even be tempted to abandon common sense while you're busy listening to other people what they think you should do. So that's it. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share with you. So this is my 1.5 miles of dual carriageway. Very grateful to be able to